Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, coming to you live from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Excited about this show. We're wrapping up a really cool series on relatively recent economic history about the 2008 economic crisis and the subsequent effects. This week in particular, I think you're going to find that it all gets brought home to the impacts of that crisis that are relevant to this day. That aren't just a matter of understanding what happened back then, but continue to have an impact today. So that should be interesting. But we've got more, a little bonus right at the beginning. We don't usually do current events on this week. We do current events on Econ Minis week. But, sometimes something's going on, you got to cover it. And fortunately, we have with us the Black Horse. Hello, sir.
How are you doing this morning? Or this
Very
evening,
good.
I guess.
Yeah, we are more or less in the similar time zone, so we're not on opposite sides of the world. Well, from that point of view, you're a little north of me. In fact, the Black Horse, relevant to what we're about to cover first, the current events, is that Black Horse is in Toronto, Canada, and I'm sorry, I should know this. Toronto is in which province?
Toronto's in Ontario. Toronto's the center of the universe for Canada.
Right.
We have a third of the population here within a 2-hour drive.
Right. Okay. Right. But then I thought you said, where's the capital?
Well, Ottawa, but the capital was chosen by the Queen because it had the nicest looking hill.
Right. So Ottawa is not in Ontario?
Ottawa is right on the border between Ontario and Quebec. So it was chosen because it was a compromise between Montreal and Toronto for power in the country at the time.
Got it. Okay. Right. Yeah. Washington, D.C. was nothing, right? It was not like a New York City or something. It was, I think similarly, it was sort of some compromise that nothing was really there, and they just said, put the capital there so people don't fight, So I think it's similar. Washington, D.C. is sort of a similar origin story, Anyway, there's been things going on in Canada, in particular. Before we get into the part that you were briefing me on before this, what are they actually protesting about? Because, as usual, there's some confusion over that. People have said it's the mandates, but my friend Morgoth is saying that, well, look at their signs. They seem to be pointing to the end game to some degree and talking about like digital IDs and vax passes.
Yes.
Anyway,
so let's talk about the state of play in Canada right now.
Yeah.
So there's some variation by region, but broadly.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I should go to the picture while we talk, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let me make sure I'm on the right one. I'm not. Okay, now I am. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, Canada has been on varying degrees of lockdown in each of the provinces for the last, month and a half since winter really started to bite home. In Quebec, that's meant curfews. That's meant limits on personal social gatherings of like 5. Mm-hmm. That's meant closing schools. That's meant limits on interprovincial travel, so you can't. So there are restrictions on crossing regional borders within the country, especially down in the eastern region. That's meant all indoor dining closed, and the fact that outdoor dining is open is kind of academic when it's minus
right.
20 outside. So that's kind of the backdrop of where the state of play that this
right. So to summarize, people are feeling these restrictions, right?
People are feeling these restrictions.
I'm sorry, people are feeling them. people are feeling them, and this is after we're going on nearly 2 years of some level of mandates, restrictions, things going on, right?
Yeah, so it's been 18 consecutive months of mask mandates where I am.
Okay,
And
right,
over the last 2 years, we've spent more time in hard lockdown than we have without hard lockdown
right.
in that period.
Yeah. Okay.
So it,
I just wanted to, you see why I'm bringing this up. I just wanted to bring up the point that it isn't like this last month and a half is all there is to the story. This is after a long time of perhaps people getting frustrated.
yes. So one of the things that's been going on in the last 6 months is the systematic application of vaccine mandates to do various activities. Um, so it started with vaccine passports to cross the to um, board airplanes and trains and to like eat in restaurants and and things. Then it sort of was applied systematically to different employers. And most recently, the Trudeau government has attempted to apply vaccine passport conditions on cross border trucking, which was the
Hmm.
proximate cause of this protest.
Now, cross
Um,
international border or cross provincial border?
Cross international border.
Okay, right. And just
So,
this is obvious to you and me, but just to any of our international listeners, um, the population of Canada is basically what 90% plus within a certain number of miles of the U.S. border. You probably know what it is, right?
yeah, 90% of the population lives within 100 miles of the US border, and almost all the trade in Canada flows north south rather than flowing east west.
Right. So
So,
if you were thinking of this as like something like the border between, I don't know, Germany and France, which probably also would be a problem if they shut down trade there. But it's sort of more dramatic, I think, for Canadians, right? I mean, this is really this really hits you when you shut down the U.S.
yeah,
Canada border.
yeah. So you have a fraction of. So this was intended to be a coercive measure in order to get truckers to uh, become vaccinated who weren't already vaccinated. Um, and so it was kind of the
Mm-hmm.
proximate cause of this protest. There
Mm-hmm.
have been, a large number of other protests against lockdowns and against mandates with varying degrees of success. So, for example, last winter, they introduced mandates for Quebec healthcare workers to get vaccinated in order to keep their job,
Mm-hmm.
and there was some systemic resistance, and enough healthcare workers refused to become vaccinated that the government was forced to drop the mandate
Got it.
um, because they couldn't keep enough healthcare workers um, in the midst of what is, in part a crisis in our healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some history here of confrontations over this kind of thing,
Right.
but there are some things that really distinguish the truck protests from the protests that have occurred previously, and to understand those distinctions, it's necessary to understand a little bit of the state of play of politics in Canada over
Mm-hmm.
the last 20 years. So Canada is it's not a country governed by a single elite. It's governed by a coalition of three independent sets of elites, uh, at least two of which hate each other, and the other's kind of a neutral party. So
Mm-hmm.
you have an elite in the prairie provinces that are intimately tied to oil and agriculture, oil and ag as their source of wealth.
Right.
You have an elite that's in the Toronto Montreal corridor. We call them the Gatineau elite. They're disproportionately bilingual, um, and they're if people see Justin Trudeau is the emblem of the Gatineau elite.
Mm-hmm.
They're the people who call the Liberal Party the natural governing party of Canada because it's the expression of that set of elite.
So
Um,
this was just leading up to something you're going to drop on us soon. Um, somebody was just saying that Senior Trudeau, I think, had really with the I guess mandate that the government be bilingual. It basically favored people who were from the French speaking from Quebec, right?
That's
And
right. It
and
it made
this
it.
means the government bureaucracy got really pulled in the direction of the Liberal Party. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so more complicated than that. So uh, the Liberal Party was in power in the 20th century for more years in Canada than the Communist Party was in the USSR. So they had absolute control over the construction of the bureaucratic apparatus in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was a very direct confrontation for control of the Liberal Party and the bureaucracy in the 70s between, and the resolution to that uh, confrontation was to solidify power in the hands of the Laurentian elite, they who are sort of disproportionately French speaking, whereas the
Mm-hmm.
Western
Right.
elite, are anglophone, are exclusive anglophones,
Right.
and have a historic grudge against Quebec.
Right. So Millennial Woes laid out like the on Telegram laid out sort of various options. He just tried to logically say what are all the ways that this could go, you know. And one that he mentioned was basically throw Justin Trudeau under the bus. Now, that could still happen, but it sounds like part of the context you're giving us is that Justin Trudeau is not just him, right? He's representing one of the sets of elites, and in
Yeah, he's
particular,
representing
the set of elite that
one of the
has had political power for the 20th century, basically. Right.
yeah, for the vast majority of the history of Canada,
Right.
they have had political power, and they've
Right.
used political power to reward friends and punish enemies very effectively
Mm-hmm.
over that period.
Right.
Um, so, fast forward into present day,
And by the way,
what you have
you
in
never got to the third. There's the
oh,
western or
the
the
third set
prairie
of
elites.
elites is the banking elite, and the
Ah,
banking
okay.
elite are much more concerned with what goes on in New York than they are with what goes on in Canada. They simply they set the borders for acceptable policy in the country, because
Okay.
they provide all the money.
Right. Right. But
So
they are not unquestionably aligned with the prairie elite or with the liberal party. They're a
no,
little
their
more.
alignment shifts over
Yeah.
time.
Got it. Got it. So you can lose their
And
support. The point is you can lose their support if you're not careful.
that's correct.
Right,
That's
right.
correct. And so the truck protest really needs to be viewed in the context of a contest between uh, the Western elite and the ruling elite. Um,
Okay, so you've told us what the
and
liberal elite has and what the banking elite has. The bankers have the money. The liberal elite has the government bureaucracy. Does the Western elite have any cards to play?
well, it has two very important cards. First of all, it's another very important source of wealth in the country because they disproportionately control
Mm-hmm.
the oil industry,
Right,
which is, for those who don't know, uh, Alberta sits over top of one of the largest oil reserves in the world.
right.
Um, and the second thing that they have is they control all of the key positions, all the key hard power positions in most of the country. So the military and the police are disproportionate, and especially the officer corps are disproportionately drawn from this elite.
Okay, but does this even include the area that you identified as more geographically aligned with the Liberal Party? That is Ottawa and Quebec, and
Yes. So
even there.
even there, so if
Okay,
you look
got
at
it.
Ontario, Ontario, which is the center of Canada, has a superposition of all three groups and their servants sitting in uh, sitting closely geographically aligned. Um, and over the course of my lifetime, the people aligned with the Western elite have gradually moved have gradually become marginalized in Ontario, but they're still very much present. And just like in the U.S., where the military and the police, well, in particularly in the U.S., the military is disproportionately drawn from one particular population. Virtually the entire Canadian military is drawn from the part of the nation which is deeply aligned with the Anglophone elite in the West.
I've,
And
I've
so,
switched this. I've switched this to a map of Canada, by the way, for those of us who don't know our geography. Um, it's a little, yeah. Oh, bummer. The way it's displaying is not good. It's because it doesn't show Ottawa and Toronto. Darn it. Okay. Anyway, but at least we can see Quebec next to Ontario. And you're saying, where do you say the corridor is? Where the Liberal elite particularly?
so the Liberal elite, if you start at the base of Lake Ontario and then draw a line up the St. Lawrence River, or about halfway to Quebec City, that's where they all live.
Mm. Oh, so it's not a huge area.
No, and something like 65% of the population of the country lives in that area.
Oh, okay. Well, it's not a huge geographic area, but it's a huge population center.
That's right.
Got it. Okay.
And then if you look at basically the rest of Ontario falls into the territory of the Western elite.
Okay, but this is a little bit, not to oversimplify, this sounds a little bit like in England, the old court versus country kind of divide, right?
Yeah.
The court
Yeah,
being that corridor you're talking about, and the country being basically the vast mass of Canada to the west.
Well, yeah, except there are actual cities out west formed by the oil industry. So
Right.
like the Western elite has their capital out in Calgary, and they've got large pools of capital out there as well.
Right.
So
Yeah, so this hard power thing, our academic agent training, you know, goes off at this point, right? With
so
the hard power.
if we look at the other thing to realize is that each of these elites has a party, or the Western elite and the East and the Gatineau elite have a party aligned with them. So the Canadian Conservative Party is really best understood as a regional party representing the interests of the Western elite, and the Liberal Party is best understood as a regional party representing the interests of the Gatineau elite. And they compete to govern the political institutions, and the Gatineau elite almost always wins that competition because there are more of them and they're richer.
Right. Having said that, well, okay. Unfortunately, we've got to drill down a little bit more on the Conservative Party because the news yesterday, was it?
Yep.
Was that the leader of the Conservative Party is essentially he's out, right?
Yes. And he's out because of a longstanding grudge between the elite that put him there, and so he promised basically in 2019 when he became leader of the party. I might be getting my dates wrong there specifically. To put an end to Trudeau governance by tacking into a moderated version of the green agenda. So his perspective was that if you included a carbon tax and some low-level anti-oil policies in the Conservative Party policy platform, that you'd be able to capture enough support in Ontario to displace Trudeau and come to a consensus to govern the whole country out of like a single governing consensus.
Okay.
He felt to deliver the promised political victory on that platform, which has had the knives out for him in his own party and in the elite that back him.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I missed it somehow. So I understand what he was supposed to do, but what went wrong?
Well, he failed to deliver the promised political victory. So we've had
okay.
He lost an election badly.
Yeah.
So he wasn't the key thing that he was supposed to deliver to the Western elites was political power. He didn't deliver the political power that he promised.
Got it.
So what the Western elites did is they dumped, $8 million in cash on a populist uprising.
Right. So this is okay. Right. So you're going to walk us through those two cards that the Western elite have. Card number one is they've got money, and they used it. So as Academic Agent has been emphasizing, um, you really don't see, maybe not never, but we are often told that, oh, this was just a grassroots movement, just regular folks rising up, and they made the elites listen to us. And he says pretty much every time you dig into it, you find that there was a counter elite or an elite in opposition to the reigning elites or whatever that ends up backing the man on the street, right? The crowds on the street. And you're saying that is absolutely the case here.
At base level, these truckers have to be able to afford to have food and stuff, and
Right.
they've been the convoys are now like 3 weeks old. Most people who are truckers can't take 3 weeks off work to
Right.
indulge in political activity.
Exactly.
They're doing that because they're being financed to do that.
Right.
Which is actually,
this is what we hear about NGOs, and so forth, right? That this is the crazy thing where you see something.
Sorry, I lost for a second.
Whoa! Uh-oh, something went wrong.
I can't hear you.
Okay, give me a sec. I don't know what's happening.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I'm getting. Do you have the audio on? Okay. Yeah, let me fix that.
Can you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now? Sorry,
guys.
Hear me? Sorry, folks. Okay.
Okay, so apparently you guys can hear me, so let's keep going. So what this elite did is they dropped a pile of money on a bunch of truckers in order to do the thing that they really wanted to do, which was protest the mandate, and to capitalize on what they knew was pretty widespread sentiment among local populations that the mandate for truckers specifically, but more broadly, the entire COVID regime had a lot of popular resistance to it. They so the truckers spent over a period of weeks, put together these convoys, went to two key places. First of all, to Ottawa, which is the one that's gotten a lot of international media attention, and second to the border between Canada and the United States in Alberta, and they blockaded both locations. It's worth noting that in both places, efforts were used to use hard power. So in Ottawa, the police were asked to close the bridges to enter the area around the Parliament buildings to prevent the convoy from actually arriving on Saturday for the scheduled protest, and the police refused to do so. And in Alberta, the police have this pathetic little blockade that they assembled to stop more truckers from joining the blockade at the border. which was bypassed by off-road farm vehicles, so that the blockade could continue to get supplies. So you can see actually the Western elite have played both of their cards in order to make these protests happen. And they've done so knowing that Aaron O'Toole, the previous leader of the Conservative Party, because of his orientation to tack towards the center in order to capture votes in Ontario, would never support the truck convoy. Both at an interpersonal level, he pretty clearly despises the people who are part of the coalition, the Conservative base, and from a political strategy point of view, it would not suit him to do so. They use this to force a confidence vote on O'Toole's leadership, knowing that the appearance of the base of all these Conservative Party members would make it very, very hard for those Conservative Party members to support O'Toole's leadership. And indeed, they succeeded. They removed O'Toole from his position as Conservative Party leader and installed somebody from the Western elite to sit as interim leader until they choose. So so putting it third, we should understand that these protesters disproportionately, or the vast majority of these people do not understand that they were leveraged in this particular game, and these are very earnest people who have deep convictions that they should have freedom, and the Western elite. This is not the chief goal of the elite which orchestrated this moment, and I highly suspect that the government of Canada is going to ruin the lives of a very large number of these protesters, and so we should have a certain degree of circumspection about what this will mean, what this protest will mean going forward. Particularly the protesters at the border of Alberta and the US, I suspect are going to find themselves with very significant criminal penalties for what they've done. And it's hard not to have sympathy for the thing that these people have been caught up in. Radlib, have you been able to find your way back in?
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, try one more time. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's weird. OBS is a little weird sometimes. OBS Ninja is a little weird. Okay, my only concern is I was getting like an echo type thing or something, or a delayed, like I was hearing what you were saying presently and what you were saying like a few seconds ago simultaneously. That was weird, but it doesn't seem to be happening right now. Okay, cool. So, right. So I'm sorry. That last bit you said that what this would mean in terms of consequences for the people involved.
Yeah, because at base level, these people think that the end of the protest is going to be the restoration of basic freedoms in Canada, whereas the goal of the elite, which backed the protests, is not the restoration of freedoms in Canada.
Right.
So not only are they probably not going to get what they want, but also the people who supported them are likely happy to see them face personal consequences for what they've done, rather than to
What?
Sorry.
Why would they don't want that for them to
Well,
face personal
they don't.
consequences. They just might not care, right?
That's the correct interpretation. They will probably do
Okay.
nothing to protect them.
Right. And I'm sorry, I
So
was having all these audio problems. You covered how they use their connections in the police and so forth to facilitate the protest, right?
yeah, to make sure that the protest would happen and to make it very difficult for the Canadian government to remove the protest.
So
So,
literally,
for
the
example,
police are like kind of helping them today, and then a couple weeks from now they'll be arresting them. Is what you're telling me?
yeah, well, it's already happened. Today, the Ottawa
Oh,
police came. Now that the confidence vote is done, today the Ottawa police came out and announced that they're going to be systematically ticketing the truckers that are there, and an announcement has been made that that if the police are unable to remove them shortly, the army will be used.
okay.
So
And
the play is
you're
over.
thinking that you're thinking the police and military will not they won't use their influence. The Western elite won't use their influence with the police and military to put a stop to that.
I highly doubt it now that they've achieved what appears to me to have been their goal.
Oh wow. So
So,
the protesters won't get anything that they want?
well, the protesters in Ottawa will probably not get anything of what they want. The protesters at the Alberta border are a more complex situation because there's an internal revolt in the Alberta government about whether or not they should lift mandates within Alberta. So if those guys hold out, they might get an end to the vaccine passport in Alberta rather than, but I highly doubt they'll get anything nationally.
Right.
At least
You're
not
not
unless the
expecting
situation.
you're not expecting Justin Trudeau to resign. You're not expecting for everything to go back to 2019 in terms of freedoms. Right.
No, the only way that that would happen is if there is a revolt is if there's an activation of the third elite in Canada, the banking elite, and thus far that has not occurred.
Yeah, you don't see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty well connected there.
Right.
There's frustration, but I don't see that they're ready to support people like not only are they not ready to support ending it, there's a big cultural gap between those people and the people on the ground protesting.
Right. Yeah.
It would be like a bunch of New York bankers backing
Texas ranchers or something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Or American truckers. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. Let's see. I had quit this. Let me get something open, namely the chat. I started quitting things, trying to figure out what was going on. Okay, that's okay then. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to see if anybody had done a super chat about the see if the super chat there was a super chat in relation to the Canada part before we move on, because now we're going to completely switch topics. Okay, thank you. Really interesting and
completely different.
Right, and kind of sad, like you said, because for those of us who'd sort of be in sympathy with the truckers, it's a glorious moment, right? But the impacts for their actual lives, well, it might be kind of like it might be like the January 6th thing, right? Where they just start going after everybody.
It's very much a light brigade moment, right? Where there's a disconnect between where the people who actually acted, I think, are going to pay disproportionately for something that probably could have been bought more cheaply. Let's put it that way.
Okay, let's see. Let's switch to ready to have that first picture, or do you want to say something
let's go for
introductory? Okay, yeah. So this
Yeah,
is
so
the
let's catch up on where we were at the end of the at the end of the last '08 stream. So in the first
yeah,
'08 stream, we laid out the general overview of the 2008 crisis, the collapse in real estate prices that led to the that led to a crisis in the mortgage-backed security market, and the rehypothecation market that led to the systemic collapse of a very large number of financial institutions. We covered at the time a program called TARP, which was used to directly intervene on behalf of a significant number of financial institutions in order to attempt to stop the domino effect of declining mortgage-backed security prices from uh, causing acute liquidity problems, from causing more bank failures. So that's kind of where we left off.
right.
And covering the TARP intervention, which was a direct intervention applied to financial institutions, is really kind of covering half of the story of how of the interventions that were taken in order to prevent acute liquidity crises. The other half is the Fed interventions that occurred during the period. So what we've got up
So TARP
right now is
TARP was not the Fed. It was
Treasury.
legislative, I guess, or Treasury. Okay, I see.
So that's the executive branch, but they're using like taxpayer
Right,
money.
got it. Okay, so they handed a bunch of taxpayer money. When people are like, "Hey, they took our money and handed it to bankers," that's essentially accurate for the TARP part of the story, right?
Yeah, and remember those are loans, so they did hand it to bankers, but
Yeah, yeah,
presumably they got some of that back eventually.
right.
Um,
Okay, so what we're seeing in this picture is the holdings of the Fed, and we see in what is that, late
yeah, so
2008, something like that. You see a little mountain start to develop there.
yeah, you actually see some action before that in sort of early to mid 2008, the expansion of this red section. So it's important to understand what the different colors here are. So the purple section is traditional securities holdings. Those are US Treasury securities that are held by the Fed in order to maintain their peg of short term interest rates. So that's the business
Right,
that
and
the Fed
that
has been
that
engaged in.
yeah, I was going to say that this is the textbook Fed. That if you like
Yes.
took a macro course, this is what you were taught. You were taught about the Fed holding treasuries, and then its buying and selling of treasuries is how it messes with the interest rate or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's how it manages short-term interest rates. So when people say the
Right,
Fed funds rate, what they're really talking about is the short-term interest rate on government bonds as managed by the Federal Reserve through their holdings of Treasury securities. And
right.
you'll see that in the middle of 2008, they decide that they're going to directly lend to financial institutions uh, to the tune of first sort of $400 billion and then larger later in the crisis. So that's what that
So
big
sorry,
expansion of.
right. So the red there. So sorry, just to make sure that people have the context, because part of what we're trying to emphasize here, I think, Black Horse, it's fair to say, is that this was a sea change, a revolutionary change. I don't know how you want to put it, but the Fed is acting differently than it had for a long time before. And as we can see to
Yes.
the right of 2008, it has continued to act differently. So all I'm saying is that little 2007 section where it's mostly purple, picture that going to the left for what, 80 years or
Basically
what,
back to
however long the Fed was around.
1930 anyway.
Yeah, back to the 30s or something. Yeah, so that was normal Fed. That's like I said, what we learned in the textbooks, because that is what the Fed did for many, 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 many decades until 2008. Okay, so anyway, go
Yes.
ahead.
Then 2008 happens. The first thing the Fed does is they start lending to financial institutions. So all of these institutions that are receiving TARP funds are receiving, you know, the first round of TARP was 350 billion. There's roughly 350 billion in Fed loans at the same time to add to direct liquidity for those institutions. Then in sort of mid to late 2008, there's you can see a massive expansion of their lending to financial institutions, as well as the introduction of this. I'm not sure what color you would call that kind of
It's like gray liquidity
gray,
to key
green,
credit
something.
markets, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is lending to specific. This is specifically replacing the sources of liquidity in the repo, stock loan, call loan markets that were being attacked by the inability to provide mortgage-backed securities as interbank collateral. So instead of another bank taking those mortgage-backed securities as collateral to support the short-term liquidity position of the bank, the Fed would take those securities as collateral and provide the same loans. And they
Right.
did that to some extent.
Yeah. So
Then,
already, before we even continue, already
yeah,
this is a massive expansion of the Fed's role in the economy, right?
yeah, and a total change in character. Um, so the to this point, the Fed's role had been to manage interest rates in the short-term treasury market, uh, in compliance with its dual mandate, full employment and anti-inflation. However you want to interpret that dual mandate. But that's broadly what it did. None of these two things, or neither of these two things, have anything to do with full employment or managing inflation. Um, they're connected to stability in the broader sense of the financial system of the United States. And this is where you get the emergence of the term plunge protection team, right? Where
I,
suddenly it
I,
is
I
the Fed's
actually I
job.
actually had not heard that. I had not heard that term. Plunge protection team comes about in 2008, roundabouts.
Yes, yes. And the term refers to the idea that whenever there's like a market catastrophe, the Federal Reserve has arrogated onto itself the role of preventing the market from realizing the full consequences of that disaster.
Right. So speaking from Austrian theory point of view, basically, uh, and bringing some judgment here, this means essentially they prevent the economy from correcting itself.
Uh,
Right.
that would be correct, right? Their
Yeah.
goal, their official goal is that they want orderly corrections rather than disorderly corrections. I'll leave it to the viewer to decide whether orderly corrections are really possible.
Right. Exactly.
So,
They soften their mandate is to soften the bust. A bust comes and they're supposed to limit the effects of the bust. From the Austrian point of view, that means limiting the clearing out of misallocations of the economy and keeping the economy in essentially a screwed up state. Investments continuing to pour into places that they shouldn't be. If we were really in a free market.
yeah, and not only that, but it should be noted that this is a rule that they arrogated onto themselves.
Oh, so this was not the legislature changing the
No,
Federal Reserve Act or something like that?
there was no act of Congress. There was no
Okay.
executive order. Um, Ben Bernanke decided, and it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So
Wow.
this is a very fundamental kind of thing. You can also see this as a great victory for managerial governance. So the Fed is I mean, they call it an independent organ of governance. So what does independent mean? Well, it means that it's not part of the political process. Um, and when an entity that is not part of the political process arrogates a large amount of additional power for itself, it's worth noting in the history of the political process.
Right. Okay. Anyway, so that just about everything we said applies before you even leave this first jump up of lending to financial institutions, lending to key credit markets. But then more goes on. What is the yellow and the blue?
Well, let's talk about the blue first.
Okay.
So the Fed's solution to how to get out of TARP was that if they just buy all the mortgage-backed securities, then they won't have to bail out the banks anymore. So there's this
Okay,
large
so
collection
wait,
of mortgage.
meaning, let me see if I'm following it. So, meaning that the banks would go back to using mortgage backed securities as they had been. It's just that instead of the previous arrangement with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the Fed would. I'm not
No,
quite following.
this is not exactly correct. So the
Okay.
problem for using mortgage-backed securities as collateral for interbank lending was that the price of mortgage-backed securities had become unstable because of the inability to pay them, because of the inability to pay the distributions, because of the failures of the mortgages inside them, right? So this is the immediate cause of the liquidity problem. One solution to this would be to get into a situation where those mortgage-backed securities were performing so that their prices would stop falling. Another way to make the prices of those mortgage-backed securities stop falling is to put a bid under them. And so what the Fed did is they put a bid under the mortgage-backed securities to prevent the prices to stabilize their prices. And as you can
So they
see
put like
here,
a. It's like they put a floor under the price of the mortgage backed securities, basically. A
that's
Fed
right.
guaranteed floor.
So you can see here they bought more than $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities. You can imagine what that does to the price of a mortgage-backed security.
Right.
So this is a very and you can see that this inventory of mortgage-backed securities never shrinks in the foregoing years. So it's not like they bought these securities and then slowly released them back into the market after stability had been achieved. They bought these securities. They continued to replace these securities as they matured out. And this is now a part of the Fed's role to provide price stability to this market.
Real quick before we leave the mortgage-backed securities, Fed holding mortgage-backed securities. Or I'm sorry, am I saying it right? They actually buy some of them and actually hold them themselves.
Yes,
Is that right? Okay. So
that's
I noticed that by 2015, a little hard to tell because of the yellow growing underneath, but by 2015, it looks like we're at what, $1.5 trillion or something.
yeah.
Um,
So the
or
number that they
almost
hold
nearly
actually
2 trillion.
the number that they're holding actually continues to expand over time.
Yeah, and is there any significance to, you'd think that the huge holdings of mortgage-backed securities would be right in the wake of the 2008 crisis, right? And they do have a lot by 2010. But then they have even more by 2015. Was there another crisis I missed, or was there some other reason? Do you have any idea?
Well, you're going to see this as we talk about the yellow here. This is
Mm-hmm.
so broadly speaking, the Federal Reserve arrogates onto itself the role of controlling the entire yield curve as a consequence of being the plunge protection team. And in order to control the entire yield curve, they have to be able to buy assets in different markets uh, in order to control the shape of yields in different markets. So what you should make of the fact that the supply of mortgage-backed securities uh, that the Fed has in inventory grows in the period between 2013 and 2015 is that this is a period of rising interest rates more broadly, and the Fed, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the price of mortgage-backed securities should not go down to reflect the rising prevailing interest rates.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so
I mean, I just
once
keep
they
thinking that the overall takeaway here is that the Feds, as the Austrians have been saying from the beginning, basically of the Fed, it was always an aspect of central planning in the economy. But it seems like what you're describing is a process of the Fed centrally planning more and more of the economy, at least the financial markets. right?
Yes. So this should be viewed as a Fed takeover of key elements of the financial markets.
Mm.
First the interbank lending market, then the mortgage-backed security market, then the shape of the yield curve for government bonds, and then much later in 2019 the repo market.
Okay, so the yellow is the buying the long-term treasuries, and that's the part where you're talking about the shape of the yield curve, right?
That's right. So traditionally, the
Yeah.
Fed's role had been to manage short-term interest rates. Um, so those are interest rates on treasuries within 1 year to maturity. And
And
then
that's that purple, that's the traditional security holdings, the purple, right?
that's right. But the Fed had let the treasury and the market dictate interest rates on long-term government debt. Um, so in 2010, they entered into an arrangement called Operation Twist. Operation Twist. So if you read your sort of your early 20th century economics textbooks, they'll tell you that the shape of the government bond yield curve predicts the expansion or contraction of an economy because it reflects the sort of risk-free rate of return for money. So in a healthy economy, long-term interest rates should be substantially higher than short-term interest rates because this reflects expectations for return on investment in competing ventures.
Right.
So in 2010, the the reverse situation was materializing all over Western economies, where long-term interest rates were the same or less than short-term interest rates, predicting a substantial contraction in the size of Western economies. The solution that the Federal Reserve and the ECB arrived at was something called Operation Twist. So rather than deal with the fact that the yield curve was predicting a contraction in either very slow growth or a contraction in the economies of the West, they decided that the right way to address this would be to reshape the yield curve themselves, um, and to cause the yield curve to reflect their preferred, to cause the yield curve to be in a shape that they believe predicted future economic growth. And they did this by
Right. So,
buying large volumes of long-term treasuries.
okay. So, two things. First of all, this, from the point of view of an Austrian analysis, just seems like an extension of what the Fed was up to anyway. That is, they're already, um, we would call it falsifying the interest rate signal, right? Which is a
Right,
key
but they were falsifying
part of the
one
economy.
interest. They were falsifying one interest rate signal. That is
Got it.
the short-term interest. That's short-term interest rates on quote-unquote risk-free bonds.
Mm-hmm.
They decided that it would be a good idea to falsify long-term interest rates on the quote-unquote risk-free yield curve as well.
Oh, okay. So it's okay. So it isn't as much of a jump from a certain point of view as I was thinking. They're literally just managing more and more interest rates, is what you're telling me.
That's right. So
Right.
in
And
the
so the
MBS
yield curve.
market, they're
Go ahead.
so it so in the government and bond market, instead of just dealing with short-term interest rates, they decided to manage interest rates across maturity dates of government bonds, or what's called the yield curve. So the yield curve is the different interest rates that apply to bonds of different maturity dates. And
Right.
if you have
So
really
so
sophisticated conceptions of the yield curve, it actually operates along, it's actually best understood as a plane where you have duration on what would be the x-axis, interest rate on the y-axis, and then across the z-axis, you have relative risk of different kinds of bonds. So government bonds would be like a two-dimensional view of that plane at the zero risk z-axis point, and then mortgage-backed securities would be to move along the z-axis to assets with non-zero risk. And you could keep going along the z-axis to other kinds of bonds, corporate bonds, high yield bonds, all that kind of stuff.
right. So Mickey said that he says could we have you know, yield curve for dummies, I guess is more or less what he's saying. And okay, let me try and tell me if I'm anywhere in the ballpark. So The yield curve is okay. So, like you said, there isn't just one interest rate, right? There is interest rate based on duration. So, I can get what are the paycheck loan, right? Where they
So
loan you money
interest
for
rates are
five
based
days
on
or something.
duration, and they're based on counterparty. So duration is the length of the loan. So you've got everything from your overnight loan to your like middle term treasury loans that are sort of 1 to 5 years to your long term yields for like 10 to 30 year bonds. So that's one dimension, and then the other dimension is counterparty. So who are you lending to? So it had traditionally been the
Right.
Fed's role to manage interest rates when lending to the federal government. The blue section
Ah,
the blue section and the red section represents interventions in yields when lending to parties other than the federal government.
okay. So they expand along. I see why you were talking about the different axes. They expand in the sense of covering, going from short-term interest rates to covering medium and long-term interest rates, right? And mortgages typically fall in those long-term, right? Because they're often
Yeah,
20 year,
that's right.
25-year, 30-year. Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
So they're getting involved in all those time markets, I guess you could put it, right? But then you're saying it's not just government bonds anymore as well. In addition to stretching out over different durations, they're also getting into things besides government bonds. They're getting into corporate bonds and mortgages
Well,
and so forth,
specifically
right?
here, they're getting into the mortgage-backed market, right?
Right.
So their intervention in the corporate bonds market really doesn't happen until much later in sort of 2020.
Oh, okay. Got it. Got it. Okay, right. Anything else we want to do on here on this picture?
Yeah, so before we leave this, I want, well, actually, maybe we'll do this when we get to the timeline. So why don't we go to our next sheet here?
All right. Turning now to the FRED, federal funds effective rate chart.
Yes.
Got it.
So this is our friendly short-term interest rates chart, what the Fed has been managing forever. And we've gone back to, how far have we gone back? 2006?
Right.
Uh,
It's a little, let's see, 2002. It's almost starting maybe 2004-ish, if I'm following
yeah, fine.
correctly.
So you can
Yeah.
see here that in the period between sort of, you can see, quote, normal interest rate policy in the period before '08. You can see '08 occurs, the Fed cuts short-term Fed funds to virtually zero and keeps them there, in perpetuity. So the second major intervention, so in addition to direct asset purchases to affect the long-term end of the curve, they uh, adjust interest rates so that they're effectively zero for short-term funds. And this is intended to encourage depositors and bondholders to deploy their money in the market and reintroduce liquidity in the banking system. This is the first intervention they take, and it fails. So you can see that this intervention actually starts in late 2007, and this intervention fails to introduce enough liquidity into the market to prevent the collapse of the mortgage-backed security assets. But it's an important
Right. The whole,
intervention, and it goes on a really, really long time, and they have no idea how to unwind it. So
right.
it's worth touching before we move on.
And the prediction from Austrian business cycle theory, right, is that, well, okay, assuming, and I think this is a safe assumption based on this chart, but you tell me, Black Horse, assuming that this interest rate is not what that interest rate would be on the free market, that is, it's lower than it would be in this case, right? Assuming that, then we would expect that using that interest rate as a signal, entrepreneurs are and investors are doing longer term projects than really makes sense and creating misallocations in the economy. and they held it there for years and years. You're showing us, right? I mean, 7 years or something, going from like 2009 to 2016. They hold it really low, and then I don't know what to think. It does come up to like a little over 2%, which still doesn't sound like much to me, but maybe you can give better context there. So
Yeah, I mean,
anyway, my
historically, it's still
expectation
very
is
low.
that, yeah, still very low. Yeah. So my expectation is starting in 2009, they're building up the mother of all bubbles. Just looking at this chart, that's what I would say.
Yeah, so it would be, you can see between this and the chart on asset purchases, you can see how the requirement to intervene to maintain the distortion increases over time. So, so this is like, when you talk about bubbles, you can say bubbles require force to, conjure into existence. And this is
Right.
the difference between this curve and whatever the natural curve for interest rates would have been, which is very difficult for us to predict because no natural curve for short-term government bond interest rates exists anywhere in the world. The
Right.
difference between this curve and what the natural curve would be is an expression of how much financial force is being exerted by the Fed in this part of the economy.
Right. But like I said, it's so close to zero. I don't think that's natural. Right.
No, I think it's, and in fact, if we were to pull the ECB version of this chart, we would find that the
Mm.
ECB held negative interest rates for long periods during this process. In fact, they may
Right.
still have negative interest rates in the ECB. I haven't looked recently.
Right. And if negative interest rate, just the whole idea of a negative interest rate blows your mind, it blows our mind too. We actually do have a show on negative interest rates if you go back in the
Yeah,
catalog,
so
trying
just in
to
the last couple
understand
of
that
weeks,
crazy phenomenon. Go ahead.
so just in the last couple of weeks, the German interest rate has finally turned positive again, but on the 10 year.
Yeah, so it's barely above zero, so we could celebrate, right?
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that whatever the natural curve looks like, it's not like this.
Yeah, okay, and just to be clear here, some people, poisoned by the financial press and Fed propaganda and so forth, might just be like, well, why do you want to, why not have low interest rates? That's great, right? Keep the economy going. Well, the point is that these things aren't really arbitrary. As you learn economics, I would recommend Austrian economics. As you learn economics, you understand that the natural interest rate is something that's real. There really is stuff out there available for investment, and there's stuff that is withheld, consumed or withheld from investment. Um, and so these are real things in the real world, and the natural interest rate coordinates our use of those real things. So when you falsify the interest rate with all these shenanigans from the Fed, for example, or the European Central Bank, then you're you're building everything on a lie, right? You're telling people that reality is a certain way when it isn't, and that might for a short time seem like things are going well or something, but you are actually causing miscoordination, right? And it will become apparent. Reality catches up. This is something we've been talking about on a number of streams recently. The real manifesting, bursting out through the illusion, right? And to some degree, that's what happens, or to a great degree, that's what happens when these occasional busts, not so occasional busts, have been happening for the last 100 years
Well, I mean,
since the
you
Fed
can
was
see a great
created.
example of it today in the Facebook earnings release, where you saw like a 25% correction in a stock representing the destruction of 200 billion in market cap overnight
Wow.
without a transaction occurring, because we're in a market where multiple expansion in tech got, way beyond what it would have been if there were competitors for the capital, because
Mm-hmm.
the intervention by the Fed has made bonds as an asset class not competitors for flows of capital to, any security that, or any investment that has any prospect of growth. So you can see this all over the Nasdaq Composite over the last 2-3 months, that you have a very, very large, you have a lot of assets where there's fundamentally no liquidity sitting underneath the price, and so you have these huge down gaps in asset price whenever negative news occurs. PayPal earlier this week is another one that gapped down more than 25%.
Okay, right. So what that tells me is if the valuations were solid, right? Like they really had the earnings. I don't know the various things that go into a good valuation, right? They really were those valuations were built on solid ground. You wouldn't have them just like drop by 25% so
Well,
easily,
one of the things to
right?
realize is that reference interest rates are a key metric in traditional valuation for assets. So whenever you're
Mm-hmm.
performing a valuation for future streams of income, which is what you're doing when you're buying a stock, that valuation is going to be based on risk-free interest rates as a point of comparison. So whenever risk-free interest rates are artificially manipulated, you end up with artificial manipulation of asset values as well as
Right.
a consequence. So if risk-free interest rates go to zero, the theoretical value of uh, perpetual future income streams reach approaches the limit of infinity, right?
So fair to say then, tell me if you agree, that looking at the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq index or whatever, um, and saying, well, look, look, things look great in the context of uh, artificially low interest rates leading to exaggerated valuations. Looking at those big stock prices and saying, "Hey, they're doing fine. Everything's cool in our economy." That is probably not a very sound way to assess the
Well,
strength of the economy, right?
what you would want to do is you would want to assess the amount of financial force required to produce those asset valuations. So
Mm-hmm.
we discussed when we discussed this chart that the difference between this chart and whatever the natural chart would be is an expression of the amount of financial force being applied. So
Right.
we know right now that uh, according to the U.S. government's own statistics, inflation is something like 7%. So if you were to look at this chart in a natural state, you would see interest rates that were at least 7% because no one would pay for a bond with a
Wow.
negative real interest rate.
Wow.
So uh, there's at least 7% in returns worth of distortion, perhaps more. It's hard. It's not possible to make that an analysis. So there's a lot of force holding valuations where they are. Uh,
Right. And
maybe
maybe
you
this
think
can address something. Go ahead.
maybe you think it's a valid role for the government to be inflating value or to be using financial force to drive valuations in the stock market up. Maybe you think that's something that should be done. Certainly keeps a lot of people like me employed, but you should understand that it's an expression of force.
Right. So I think this brings us to a question Mickey asked in the chat, which I thought was very good. He says, "What is the Fed's reasoning behind intervening? For example, what interest is it of them to get into long-term bonds?" So let me give my answer, and then you can give a smarter answer. So I think my answer is that when you're doing something artificial, as Mises talked about, intervening in the economy with for short-term interest rates and then more and more interventions. Um, it Reality keeps leaking out, I guess is what I'm trying to get to, and so you end up having to intervene more and more. Is that making sense, Black Horse?
Yeah, that's right. This is why the metaphor of the plunge protection team is apt. So what you have
Mm,
is more and more interventions required to deal with more and more quote leaks of reality. So in 2008 we have a leak of reality from this bubble, so there's an intervention
Right.
required. But as you can see, the amount of force, if you were going to just intervene to stop a crisis and then allow a natural resolution after that, you would expect there to be a lot of force used in 2008 and then declining force over time. But what you actually see is increasing force over time,
Mm-hmm.
because
Right.
they're not allowing that uh, they're not allowing the unraveling of the system that caused the crash in the beginning.
Right. 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 They're trying to keep the illusion going, and it becomes more and more difficult to keep the illusion going over time. Right.
And it turns out that in this case, the Fed has lots of resources, and so it tries harder and harder. And we've
Right.
yet to determine what the limit of the Fed's capacity to do this is, but there's there's at least a theoretical limit.
Yeah. Now, just to give a counterexample, haven't we seen cases where countries are not like the Fed, or I don't know, maybe even the European Central Bank has a lot more latitude, right? But aren't there smaller countries that just crash? They can't
Well,
keep it up.
the issue is whether there's a competitor for their dollar, right? So what happens in countries where there's a lot of direct intervention in the monetary system? Well, eventually you reach a point where uh, competitors emerge to that monetary system and undermine the ability to maintain the illusion. So
Got it. Got it.
in a lot of Latin American countries, you saw this in like the period between 1980 and 2005, with the U.S. dollar serving as a direct competitor to the local monetary system,
Right.
with
Dollarization
comparative
or whatever they called it. Right.
comparative stability. So if you don't control the if people are using currencies other than your currency, then your ability to exert the basis of the Fed's financial force, quote unquote, is that they can print more dollars. Basically, they can always
And
buy more
and
assets.
and people still accept them. That's the
People
key
accept
thing, right? Is
people accept the Fed notes in exchange for their assets, whatever they are.
right.
When you start to see the limits of this, so in Canada in the early 90s, we had a phenomena where it became impossible to sell Canadian government bonds in Canadian dollars, so they had to be sold in US dollars. And not coincidentally, immediately after this became the case, the Canadian government got religion about deficit spending and cut its spending dramatically in order to uh, prevent a fiscal crash. On the other hand, you have
Oh,
countries like Argentina that go all the way over the cliff.
right. Okay. Well, it sounds like you came up with a great example along the lines of what I was thinking, which is Canada. And you're saying that Canada bumped up against the limit of how much people were going to accept. Um,
That
well,
that's correct.
devaluation of the Canadian dollar, I guess. Right.
Yeah, so you saw the Canadian dollar go from like 90 cents US to 60 cents US in relatively
Ooh,
short order. And
yikes.
as a consequence of that, investors were no longer willing to take Canadian dollar denominated bonds, or at least not willing to do so in the same numbers as before, for
Right.
reasons that should be obvious. And
Yeah.
that is the natural limit. How many US dollars you can pump into the system before people stop accepting them is a limit that we've not yet we don't have any history with.
Or maybe another way to put it is the Fed seems determined to find it based on their behavior. Right.
That would be an alternate expression. It's also why if you were a member of the US financial elite, you should be trying very, very hard now to prevent the emergence of alternate currencies. Um, so you
Ah,
should be
yes.
exerting a lot of physical force to prevent the use of. I mean, FDR did this when he went and rounded up all the gold. Um,
Right.
if you were intent on pursuing this course and doing it competently, you would be rounding up all the Bitcoin or something.
Which, as far as I can tell, I expected them to come down harder on
Yeah,
cryptos, and they
well,
really
that's what I
haven't.
say. The level of competence here is concerning. I don't
Right.
know whether they don't realize the existential threat or or just what, but um, anyways, I'll leave that to the viewer for interpretation.
Okay, anything else we want to get from this chart before we move on?
No, I think we're ready to go to the next chart.
Right, and so just to make sure everyone's clear, what's dramatic about this chart is how low it is. In the last chart, we were watching the Fed holding more and more assets, right? And so we're watching how high up it goes. That's the significance. With the interest rate, it's that they're holding the interest rate so insanely low. That
And
is
it's
not
not just
something
that
you
they're
can
holding
do.
it low, it's that they're keeping
Yeah.
it there, that it doesn't move.
Mm-hmm.
A key, like anytime you're looking at a valuation chart for anything, if the valuation never changes, you're looking at a valuation that's fake in some way.
Oh, that's interesting. Right. Yeah. Right. So if we were to believe that this reflected reality, we would have to believe that between 2009 and 2016, there was nothing affected the interest rate, basically. Right.
Yes.
The interest rate remained in some sort of bizarre stasis bubble. Um, Now it did stay in a bizarre stasis bubble, but it's not because things weren't happening around, things weren't happening in the economy that would have an effect on the interest rate. It's that the Fed was continually intervening throughout this time to keep it there, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so completely artificial, constant multiplying miscoordination, misallocation, and coordination problems is what this chart tells us. That's what it says to me. That's not true. Okay,
Yeah.
so next chart.
Next chart. So what you're
Okay,
looking at
so
here is, instead of a chart of the Fed's assets, you're looking at a chart of the Fed's liabilities. So these are things that the Fed owes to other people. The primary liability of the Fed at all times should be currency in circulation. That's their mandate, to manage money supply.
right, and again, just to repeat the obvious, take that left part of the chart where it is almost all currency, and use your mind to extend that backward to the 1930s or something like that, right? This is
Yeah,
no this the very beginning of this chart was normal for a long time.
yeah. Actually, even before it was formally the Federal Reserve, the chart of the
Mm,
precursor institutions would have looked like that.
right.
Um, so you can see like a tiny little section of uh, yellow, I guess that is that color, and
Mm-hmm.
that's like
Yellow, yeah.
foreign deposits in the Fed and repos with other central banks. That historically, that's because there are a number of other countries that uh, have special relationships with the U.S. dollar. Um, so there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
countries that are not the U.S. that use the U.S. dollar as their currency, and there's some interactions with the Fed that deal with that. But what we're really concerned with here is the orange section and the red section, and their appearance and massive inflation over the period of time. So one of the things that happens after '08, and we're going to cover it a little bit more directly later, is the Dodd-Frank Act. The Dodd-Frank Act introduces new standards for liquidity uh, for for financial institutions, broker dealers, and banks. Um, and those standards qualify. So if you recall back to the previous stream, we discussed internal liquidity standards for banks and broker dealers. Uh, for short-term liquidity, a key element of them was identifying what assets are high quality, quote unquote, high quality liquid assets. And one of the key issues in the financial crisis was that uh, mortgage-backed securities backed by a Fannie Mae guarantee were considered high-quality liquid assets for the purposes of these funding models. Well, Dodd-Frank and Basel III internationally uh, begins a process of restricting what assets are considered high-quality liquid assets for the purposes of meeting regulatory liquidity thresholds. And as a consequence of that restriction and the continued existence of a lot of other assets in the marketplace, a lot of banks are compelled to commit liquidity to assets deemed high quality and liquid. One of those asset classes is deposits at the Federal Reserve. So if they deposit money at the Federal Reserve, then that's considered a high quality liquid asset with 100% liquidity ratio on it. And the Federal Reserve started to pay interest, even nominal interest, on those deposits in 2008.
Okay, right. So
So
this is not spontaneous, right? Uh, action by the banks. This is legislation saying you, in a roundabout way, you've got to deposit money at the Fed, right?
that's right.
Yeah.
And the consequences of this in the broad economy are not particularly well understood at this point, but it's such a large phenomenon, it can't really be passed over in analysis of the crisis. It's there needs to be a broad understanding that the distinction between the Federal Reserve and the non-money center banks substantially these institutions used to be very distinct and separate, and they're much less separate in the post-crisis world than they were in the pre-crisis world.
Wait, I'm sorry. Which institutions?
So the non-money center banks and broker dealers. So previously, if you were not a money center bank or if you were a broker dealer, you would have had essentially no interaction with the Federal Reserve before 2008. Now you probably have money deposited there.
What, money center? I don't know that term.
A money center bank those are banks that are responsible for the distribution. They're banks through which the Fed actually releases cash into the economy. It's a whole rabbit hole to go down and explain what a money center bank is. But
no, that's fine. That's fine. That gives me the idea. Basically, even if all they're doing is replacing currency, right? Because they'll take out older bills and print new bills just as old
even if they're not even a
right?
bank, even if they're a broker dealer and all they're doing is investing clients' money, they probably now have deposits at the Fed.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I don't really understand what that means though. So if the banks have deposits at the Fed, okay. Oh well, okay. For one thing, it means what you're showing us here, which is that these are part of the liabilities of the Fed. That is, the Fed has things on their balance sheet that they essentially owe to these banks, right? They belong to the banks, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that's point number one.
In terms of what it
point
means,
number two is what is this? What does it mean?
This means a lot less than the previous two charts, but it means that every institution now has direct contact with the federal government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being. So it means that in the same way you have a
instead of being downstream from like the money center banks or whatever.
Instead of only being kind of very indirectly affected by whatever the Fed policy is, the Fed actually has a policy lever that can touch every financial institution of consequence in the nation.
Wow. What could possibly go wrong?
So to this.
Okay, so that is the orange.
That's the orange.
Sorry, go ahead.
And the treasury accounts, instead of depositing cash, you can deposit treasury notes as well. So.
Oh, okay, I see. So really, the orange and the red are this wide, broadly distributed interaction between the Fed and financial institutions that is new as of late 2008, basically.
That's right. And to this point, this lever has not been used particularly for anything that I know of, but its existence is worth noting.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, okay, well, just imagine a scenario. If the Fed wanted to, it could do what? Make it more expensive to deposit money at the Fed, or what would they do?
So the Fed could make it more expensive or more lucrative to deposit money at the Fed, and as a consequence, this is another lever that they have to affect prevailing interest in the broad
Hmm.
economy. And I think
Okay.
part of the reason they haven't done anything with this is interest rates have been at virtually zero in perpetuity since this lever was established. So there's never been unless you wanted to use negative interest rates in a meaningful way, like they did in Europe, you would.
Right.
It's not like you can push money out into the economy through this lever unless interest rates are above zero.
Hmm. Right.
So I
Right.
mean,
But
you
if somehow it got away from them and interest rates started rising and they didn't want that, they could actually use
yes,
this as
this
part
would be
of
a
trying to
lever to
bring the
prevent it.
interest rate back down. Yeah, got it. Okay. So something to keep in the
Equally, if
back
they
of
were
our
the
heads.
ECB and decided that they wanted interest rates to go below zero, they could use this as a
Hmm.
lever to make interest rates go below zero.
It's just, even though we had a whole show on it, it still just bends my mind. Negative interest rates. It's like, what?
Well, negative
Anyway.
interest rates you should understand as an expression of force, right?
Hmm.
And this is one of the mechanisms through which force can be used.
Right. Okay. So anything else to highlight? We're starting to, with this chart and then the next one, we're starting to not just understand sort of the ongoing implications of what happened in 2008 and 2009, the interventions and the expansion and the power of the Fed and so forth. But we're getting a little peek at more recent history, right? So tell us.
Rehashed entirely. So all the same tools are used again and to the same effect. So
Okay, so
you
so let
have
me let me pause you. Wait, let me pause real quick. So it sounds like you're saying that in 2008, 2009, as you've been spelling out over this series, we see what you might call innovations, right? We see the Fed
yeah,
doing things it hadn't done before. We see the Treasury doing things it had not done before, right? But are you telling me that as of these last couple of years, with the COVID pandemic stuff and all that, it's not so much that they're innovating, it's that they're taking things that were already established in 2008 and they're just dialing them up, right?
yeah, that's right. So they created a
Okay.
toolkit in 2008 for controlling interest rates broadly in the economy, and as a consequence of doing so, controlling the valuations of most types of assets. Uh, and after 2008, they leave this mechanism in place and continue to use it. And you know, in 2020, they use the same toolkit, but they turn the dial, proverbially up to 11 to see how much they can do to support asset prices in the face of an environment where you would have expected asset prices to radically decline.
Right. And my understanding from the stock market and so forth is that if their goal was to keep like stock prices up, for example, they basically did it, right?
That's right. You didn't see
Yeah.
substantial declines in either stock prices or real estate prices or
Hmm.
private equity prices. They if their new mandate is now asset price stability, they have wonderfully succeeded in the exercise of that mandate.
Yeah. So it's like the economy crashed but made no noise or something. You know what I mean? Like the
Yeah.
economy like was brought to a standstill, but if you looked at the charts, you could hardly tell anything was going on.
Well, especially if your chart went quarter to quarter instead of like day to day,
Hmm.
right?
Oh, because
So
you're
if your
saying
chart
if
went
you on the day to day
if
you
your
do
chart went
you do see some of it.
yeah, so if your chart went day to day, you can identify the day that lockdowns were introduced in the United States
Hmm.
by looking at a
Hmm.
chart of S&P prices. But if you zoom out and look quarter to quarter, there's almost no noise in asset prices.
Right, because they very quickly made use of the 2008 tools, and it looks like they really made use of them heavily. Right.
Yeah, at a scale significantly larger than they were made use of in 2008. It's also worth noting
So
that uh, the tools are actually used in the period between 2013 and 2016 to a greater degree than they were made use of in the actual crisis.
yeah,
So
I noticed
both
that.
in this chart and in the chart on in the chart of asset purchases, you can see that in the
Hmm.
latter part of the Obama presidency, there was more effort to prevent a decline in asset prices than even occurred in the period after '08.
And why was that?
Well, so why was that? um, the, with respect, that's a question for the Fed chair. If I were to
Sure.
suppose, this was in order to prevent a recession from being recognized in the GDP numbers.
Right. Okay. Okay. They were fighting a correction that was trying to happen, and they were trying to keep it from happening. Something like that.
That's correct.
Okay. Just to do some numbers real quick. So a couple years into managing the 2008 crisis, let's see. These are the liabilities of the Fed in this case. The liabilities are ticking above 2 trillion, right? After this
Yeah.
Obama action, we're up to 4.5 trillion of liabilities for the Fed, and now with 2020, it starts to hit above 7 trillion. And we didn't extend this to today, but your expectation is it's probably still in that neighborhood. It hasn't. They haven't reduced their liabilities significantly in the last 12 months or whatever, right?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So this is, I mean, these charts seem to tell a story that we are really, the Fed is really in uncharted waters. Is that fair to say, Black Horse?
Yeah, there is no playbook for what's going on now. So the reason we called the first stream the Friedman crash is because it represents a circulation of elite and ideology in control of the Treasury and the Fed. And you can
Mm-hmm.
see in these charts a total departure in action from the period before to the period after. So people are, in the last couple of years, the term MMT has become popularized, but MMT started the day that the 2008 financial crisis intervention started.
Got it. Okay. So when we say Friedman, I guess you could say that this period that we're just seeing the tail end of on this chart and the previous chart in like 2007, early 2008, that
Yeah, so we're
is
looking at the
sort
period
of the
between
Chicago
2008 and
school. Go ahead.
we're looking at the period between sort of 2008 and maybe 1970, where the Chicago school
Right.
was dominant in the institutions.
Right. Right. In particular, the Chicago school idea of like how the Fed should work, as well as sort of something like their rule based idea of what the Fed should do. All of that is in operation for almost 40 years, right?
Yes.
And then
And
you hit the
all
2000,
that dies the day the 2008 crisis occurs.
right? And they throw all that out and they just start doing this crazy stuff. And we are still in the middle of it, and they are accelerating these actions. They're not bringing them down, as far as we've seen, right? They've doubled down and tripled down on these kinds of interventions into the economy.
That's correct.
Whee. Okay. Next chart.
Yeah, so this chart separates out the timeline here of the Fed's balance sheet, broadly understood, so that it can kind of be seen. So you get the, sorry, I got to pull up the chart on my side.
Yeah, and what's neat about this chart is that it actually shows us different of actions, or I don't know what to call them. They're almost like military campaigns or something, right? The QE1,
Yeah,
QE2.
it's probably a reasonable way to understand them. So QE1 is, so all this stuff we've seen in the first chart that we looked at, but this puts it on a nice timeline and identifies the events.
Mm-hmm.
So QE1, quantitative easing Mark 1 in 2008, is the first real departure from the Fed's traditional role in the economy. QE2 is where they decide that role should expand. QE3 is also called Operation Twist, occurs in that period
Mm-hmm.
2012 to 2013. And then on the right-hand side, we see the introduction of the repo bill, or of the repo facility, which is a facility not charted on the Fed's traditional balance sheet for purchasing overnight loans in the interbank lending market. So it's a way of the Fed increasing or decreasing the cost to borrow on an overnight basis. And they did this as a response to a liquidity crisis not broadly understood, which occurred in late 2019.
Yeah, I
Because
was going to say
within
this
3 months,
is before COVID, or just before,
that's
in
right.
fact, months before, right?
So in the period shortly before COVID, there was a crisis which threatened to cause acute liquidity problems at critical U.S. banks. I was intimately involved in some of the details of this, so I can only speak. There's there are limits to what I can say about this, but
Right.
the, this this crisis never made popular headlines because it was cut off before its consequences were allowed to affect the banking system broadly, and it was a
Right. But
crisis
you're
as a
saying
con.
people like you on the inside definitely knew it was happening.
Yes, and the what was happening was that short-term interest rates, like when I say short-term, I mean like overnight interest rates. So if you're lending money from one bank to another overnight, uh, were rapidly spiking on some nights up to 10 and 12%, uh, which was a situation that was totally untenable for the banking institutions that rely on those markets. Equally, the stock loan market and um, the call loan market in um, were very vulnerable to price shocks at the time. And the Fed decided that rather than allow this to play out, they were going to introduce a variant of QE to provide liquidity in the repo market up to 700 billion in order to assure what can only assume are price goals for the interbank repo market, though they never actually say on what basis they're going to activate the facility.
So this would fit into that category we've been describing of reality leaking out. In this case, in the short term, the very short term, the overnight market.
Yep.
Is that fair to say? And then the Fed
Yeah,
jumps
and
in and says, "No, no, no, we're not going to let that happen."
we're not going to let that happen. Here's $700 billion to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, well,
So
we
that's
didn't get to see how that played out very long on its own because within a couple months we're into the unlimited QE, as it says here, right? In response
yeah,
to the COVID stuff, the lockdowns and so forth.
yeah, and it's worth noting the unlimited QE is in itself as numerically significant as everything that came before it combined.
Right, because we go from 1 trillion in the Friedman period, the Chicago School period, 1 trillion on the Fed balance sheet up to 4.5. So that's a jump of 3 to 3.5 trillion, and now we've jumped another 3 trillion or more just
Another
in the
3
last two
trillion
years.
as of early 2020. So this chart cuts
Oh, and it's
off like summer of 2020. Unlimited QE has continued, um,
oh
until
my
morale
goodness.
improves.
So do you know what that number? Can we? Is it easy to just quickly pull the Fed balance sheet number like right now, what it is right this moment,
That's a good
just
question. I
to
don't
let us
know if it's
know?
easy to pull or not.
And it's just Fed balance sheet, right? Something like that.
Yeah, they have some stuff on their, yeah, so they're at 8.5 trillion now.
Okay. So yeah,
So
from this
they've had a
chart, there's
program.
another trillion, almost trillion and a half on top of what we're seeing in this chart.
Yeah, so they had their current QE program involves purchasing, I think it's 130 billion in assets a month. So that's what they're doing right now. And actually, a lot of the
Wow.
current action in the market is because they've announced that they're going to pare back this program and slow the rate of increase of the size of their balance sheet.
Yeah, not stop growing the balance sheet, but as usual when you're talking about Washington D.C., just a slow in the rate a slowdown in the rate has everybody freaking, right?
Yeah, yeah.
A
Well,
slowdown in the rate of growth, I meant to say.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It's up there with cutting spending by reducing the rate of increase of spending.
exactly. Right. Yeah, that kind of thing. Right. But it is. I mean, we joke, but it is actually having real effects that they are slowing down the growth. Right.
Yeah, I mean it's a change, um, and it's
Okay.
having real
So
effects in the market. So
right. So the overall picture I'm getting is that this is. I don't think I had quite this picture that the Fed was doing things that were novel, starting in 2008. More than one thing that's novel, um, and that it has uh, only grown in the use of these novel tools or instruments, whatever you want to call them. It's only grown, doubled down, tripled down over the 10 years following. And then in the last 2 years, again, it went even more crazy with these tools. So if we were to imagine, which I think Austrians would generally see it this way, if we were to imagine that this is not stable, the things they're doing, that this is they're the tiger by the tail, right? As Hayek said, they've got a tiger by the tail. I mean, it seems like that's what I was saying. Why you shouldn't just like look at the stock market numbers and say, oh yeah, economy's good. Um, the story you're laying out here is that um, it seems like there's some real fragility in the system. Now, as you said, we don't know how far the Fed can take this. How much will the world absorb um, abuse of the U.S. dollar, basically by the Fed, right? So this could go on for decades. I don't know, but it sure seems like something could come along that takes them by surprise, or just loss of confidence, something like that, and it would be a serious house of cards coming tumbling down. It wouldn't be a minor
yeah,
adjustment. It would be a
well,
huge
it's
crash.
it's also worth considering when you have the U.S. government doing things like threatening Russia with taking them off the U.S. dollar as a standard. That
Right.
that's a very interesting threat, right? Because it sure as hell cuts both ways.
Yeah, yeah. Like they're probably not going to make that threat to China, right? Because I assume cutting China out of U.S. dollars would instantly crash our economy, the U.S. economy.
Yeah, I mean it would have cutting anyone out of U.S. dollars creates a vacuum for alternative standards. But as
Oh,
we
I
said
see
with
what you're
the
saying.
crypto discussion, it's not clear to me that the elite that are managing this really understand. Um, it's not clear to me what their impression of what they're doing is. Like, uh,
Right.
they're essentially managing interest rate. They're managing the money supply the way that like Blizzard manages the World of Warcraft item store by creating sinks and well springs of liquidity. Um, but I don't think they understand the limitations of that, or based on their actions, they don't appear to understand the limitations of that game.
Right. Yeah. Didn't I just see something about China and Russia talking about having like their own SWIFT system and
Well, they've had
basically like
discussions
get us off
forever
this
about
train. Oh, okay. They have.
yeah, they've because what you should understand that uh, the use of the U.S. dollar and particularly pegs to U.S. dollar in countries like China, these are not done for the client state. China, you know, many of the other states that are pegged to the U.S. dollar are supposed to get out of that currency stability, and in exchange, the U.S. government gets to tax them through inflation. So there's something like 20 trillion in foreign cash holdings of U.S. dollars by governments, let alone whatever there is with individual citizens. So if you think what 7% inflation represents on those cash holdings, that's like more than $1 trillion worth of effective revenue recaptured by the U.S. dollar by the U.S. government by creating that inflation. So if the US dollar declines in prominence as a standard for countries like Russia or China or other geostrategic enemies, the ability to effectively tax foreign citizens in order to pay for the shortfall of taxation versus spending in the United States will decline.
Right. Yeah,
So,
I guess you
anyways,
don't have any
that's
other you don't have any other comments on how what you think the limits are to how long they can play this game. I mean,
well. I
you
mean,
brought up a couple,
I
right? Which is other countries can just get sick of it, right? There can be a flight into. It doesn't even have to be a big flight, but just a credible threat of a cryptocurrency becoming a really, people start really using it on a big scale. And by big scale, I don't mean like 50% of purchases worldwide are now made with Bitcoin, but more like 3% of purchases are made with Bitcoin or something, right? Globally. That would mean
yeah.
that you don't really need to play the USD game anymore and be taxed in this way through the inflation tax. Um, so yeah, any other thoughts on sort of things that could
Well, so
bring it
we
all
know
to
the
an end?
mechanism. Those are the two mechanisms that are likely to cause Bitcoin. I use this as a stand-in for any number of potential alternative currencies, but those are
Right,
the two
right.
known mechanisms by which this kind of thing ends. Uh, how much abuse the US dollar can take before one of those mechanisms succeeds in displacing it. Uh, if I knew that, I'd be much wealthier than I am.
Right, right. Okay, so the two mechanisms then are on the one hand cryptos or not cryptos, alternative currency of some sort. Could be crypto, could be something else. Um, and then the other one would just be countries just exiting the system and just
Yeah,
saying,
and
no, we don't want to
that
hold
that
US dollars
in a
anymore.
sense that in a sense is alternative currencies that are somebody else's fiat.
Yeah, right, right, right. Yeah.
So we
We're
decide
just gonna
we decide we like
we're just
Russia's
gonna be
fiat
yuan
instead of the
based.
US.
We're
Yeah.
gonna be yuan based instead of USD based in China now.
Yeah. So those are the two kind of exit mechanisms that are well understood. Um,
Right.
there are always exit mechanisms that are not well understood. I'm sure if uh, I'm sure if a meteor hit Washington D.C., we wouldn't be using U.S. dollars for very much longer either. So, um,
Okay, well, I've got two tips to read, and let's just do those real quick. They're both before our stream started. One was actually about last week's. Ike Broflovsky wrote Great Stream with the Frog King, and then he pointed me to a green investing article. I actually ran it by Black Horse, and Black Horse thinks it's got the right focus. So I'm considering covering that next week on Econ Minis. And then faithful supporter Sam153 and Tipper says 2008 Part 3, we shall make that line go up, he says. That's true. True enough. Um, yeah, I mean, what is it like for you as someone who's, uh, more in the middle of these things, I guess you could say, um, to understand, to learn, I don't know, maybe you've known economics all your life, but, and at some point you must have added it all up and gone, oh, wow, this whole thing is based on something that's really shaky, ultimately.
yeah, I mean, I look at my own position and I would say that. Uh, so to apply some critique to the Austrians who advertise themselves on the internet, um, I really
Mm-hmm.
don't think that a couple of percentage points on inflation is an expensive price to pay for the relative stability that the U.S. dollar has provided in the period between sort of 1980 in the period between sort of 1995 and 2010 or in 2008. Um, so for most of my early life in the industry, the critiques of this system uh, didn't really land very well because it's true that you were paying a price for control of the monetary system, but it seemed like that price was worth it. Um,
Interesting.
And in the period after '08, um, everybody I knew inside the industry realized that we were entering a new epoch, and that uh, things were not going to be the same in the foreseeable future. Um, and that was an interesting experience. It turned out to be good for me personally, but I think it was really quite bad for the industry broadly. Um, it meant that a whole segment of the industry that used to be about resource allocation became a controlled element of the industry. That's the
Mm-hmm.
bond market surrounding government bonds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 2020 is, and what's happened since then is something different altogether. Um, this channel has covered bits and pieces of it. The Fed interventions are a piece of it. The ESG stuff is a piece of it. Um, I would say that I got into the industry because I believe that effective resource allocation is a moral imperative because it's what
Mm-hmm.
has created this enormous quantity of wealth that has, relieved all kinds of terrible human suffering all over the world.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
the fact that that process is being disrupted by power is something that grieves me deeply, um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and has made me, um, you know, much. If you were to have talked to me in 2006, I would have been pretty all in on the value of the current economic system versus any other economic system that had ever existed. Um, I think today that my presence on this show speaks for itself.
Right. You have concerns. Oh, now, would you say you mentioned sort of the mood of folks around you in the industry that maybe aren't sitting around learning Austrian economics? Um, what has that been like? You said that everyone was feeling in 2008, 2009. Oh, okay, we're going into a new place. And now then, with the extraordinary actions of the last 2 years, is there just a general sense of like this is a little scary here? This feels tenuous, or what do you get from people?
Yeah, I mean, there's different parts of the industry have different concerns, but there's a lot of existential angst on Wall Street right now. Uh, Between the vast growth of the private equity markets, uh, the uh, Fed capture of large parts of what the industry used to do privately, um,
Mm-hmm.
and ESG replacing earnings as a metric for investing. There's a lot of
I'm sorry.
existential angst about
What's ESG?
environmental, social, and governance standards. So this is what you're going to get into
Mm.
on minis at some point, where you talk about the process of indexing and capital allocation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Oh yeah, yeah. It's
so
politicizing the investment process is the executive summary, I think. Right?
yeah, exactly. Um,
Yeah.
and so, like, most people in the industry are still just heads down. They've got a job to do. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but all of us see that, a real watershed moment in the industry was when we noticed that uh, the balance sheets of Google or Apple or Amazon were large enough that they could replace the major banks if they knew how to do it. Um, and that sort of happened in the period sort of 2017, 2018. Um, and I would say that that angst has increased as the process that we're going through, whatever that process ends up being called, has continued.
Right. Now you mentioned about the growth in the private equity market. Can you? We're not doing a whole show on that, but could you just give a sense of what's going on there?
Yeah. So what's happened here is in the period uh, after 2000. So everybody might remember there was a collapse in asset prices in the tech market in 2001. The period after that, in order to avoid the scrutiny that comes with the public markets, uh, tech investors have opted to keep companies that would otherwise have gone public private for much longer. So, for example, Twitter didn't go public until it was worth, several $billions. Um, Similar
Oh, okay.
story for Facebook. Similar story for uh, like similar story for virtually every company that has come out of that has come out of Silicon Valley in the last 10 years. Most of the
Okay, and you're
returns
saying
have occurred during the period where they were private rather than during the period they were public.
right. So you're saying that we see the ones that have gone public, as you mentioned, some rather late in their life relative to how things used to be done. But I'm assuming you're telling us that the growth in the private equity market means there's a lot of other companies that haven't gone public and remain privately held.
That's right. A much larger fraction of invested capital right now is in the private equity market than was the case prior to 2001.
Okay,
And not
but
only a much
is
larger
that
fraction of capital, but a much larger fraction of capital that's invested in growing companies. So if you were to
mm-hmm.
try to invest in quote growth companies in the public markets, it would be very difficult to do because most companies are done their growth phase by the time they go public now.
Right? So you have to
So
be.
there,
This is not the right term, but you have to be like an angel investor. That's not. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah.
That kind of
You have to
thing,
be
right?
participating in the private equity markets, which are very heavily
Yeah.
gate kept in a way that the
Right.
public
Right.
equity markets are not.
So what is the implication of more of that growth happening in the private equity market rather than in the publicly traded market?
Well, for the financial industry, it means that it means less successful investment will occur in the industry, and more successful, because the private equity industry is, it's separate from the capital markets part of the industry that I spend my time in, right?
Right.
Um, and the greater the fraction of the market that exists in the private equity sphere, um, the less that we get exposed to, and it's a competitive relationship.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that isn't the growth in the private equity market weighs on folks in your industry because it's a competitor, basically. That doesn't necessarily mean that a shift to the private equity market is destabilizing for the economy overall,
No, it
right?
represents a shift in power between one group and another.
Yeah, okay, got it. So it's sort of an intra investment elite thing, is what you're saying.
That that's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. As opposed to all I mean is the other things you mentioned would make you nervous just about the economic structure in general, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas this
That's
is
right.
just sort of a shift within the economic structure. It doesn't mean that the whole thing is a house of cards. Whereas
No,
some of the
and
other
who
things you
knows? Maybe
mentioned
the private
do mean
equity
that.
people will deliver a more stable economy. Who knows? But
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yeah,
but it's
with all
certainly a
their
source of bellyache on Wall Street anyway.
yeah, yeah, with all their investment based on insanely low interest rates, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What could go wrong? But that is not. It's hard, right? Because that is not. I mean, maybe there's a relationship. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like that would necessarily. That's sort of orthogonal, right? Like you could have a shift.
Well,
In theory, you could have a shift to private equity markets with a natural rate of interest in the economy, right? As
yeah,
opposed to
and
this artificially low one.
but one of the things that the viewers of this program would be very interested to understand is that it represents a gatekeeping out of ownership of the general public in a lot of the important institutions in the Western
Got you.
world.
Right, where there had been a long run trend of like mutual funds and things like this with the idea that everybody
That
can
regular
get in
people
on,
got to participate in ownership,
yeah,
right?
yeah, everybody can be in on a growth market and stuff like that. And now we're going back to what a little bit trending back towards how it used to be, which is that unless you were part of the financial industry, you did not get a piece of that growth pie, for example. And we're
That's
basically
correct.
getting back to that at this point. Yeah, right. Which seems to be a running trend that we're seeing. The 1% owning more and more of everything. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Cool. Excellent. Black Horse. Thank you so much for these three shows. Folks, if you haven't caught up, I guess I should be able to bring up my own channel. Let's see if I can pull that off. Uh, oh, nope, not that way. Here. I just wanted to remind everybody of the names of the shows so that, in fact, maybe now that they're all done, I should go back through the descriptions and just put like part 2, 3, part 1 and 3, and so forth in each one, so that if somebody finds one of these videos, they can find the whole trilogy. So we started with the Milton Friedman crash. That was part 1 in this series. Part 2, too big to fail, and now part 3, the Fed levels up. Those 3 together give us the story both of 2008, and then as we focus this time on the ongoing impact of the measures that were taken as a response to the 2008 crash. So I think a pretty amazing story, and really fortunate to have Black Horse, who I described as kind of a ringer. um, uh, he has knowledge that I don't have, shall we say, about the financial market. So financial markets. So really,
Well,
we're
thanks so
really
much for
blessed to
hosting
have
me.
Black Horse. Yeah, thank you
And
for all your prep for this. And we again we should thank Ryan Turnipseed, who ended up having to take a really good class on Thursdays and is out for a while from being involved with the show. But you and he had actually put together sort of the idea for the series, as well as he was helping with slides for the first 2 parts. And he said something to me, and let me see if I can find it. Oh, crap. He said something about don't forget to bring something up, because that was one of the ideas of the
oh
thing.
yeah, he wanted to talk about so there
Yeah.
are a little bit of inside baseball. There was some consternation over whether or not the show was going to happen this week. So there was an element of this discussion of the consequences of '08 that didn't get properly prepped for. So one of the other things that happens at the end of '08 is something called the Dodd-Frank Financial Stability
Mm,
Act, which establishes, I mean, it's one of these 8,000-page acts of Congress. It's got, the good in it where it, if you're a fan of using regulators to do something, it establishes in a liquidation plan for all major financial organs. There's, the bad in it where it radically increases the authority of the federal government to enforce a whole pile of different laws that have little or nothing to do with the financial crisis or even maybe the financial system as traditionally understood. Um, so
right.
it's in part because of '08 that the feds can track. They gain a whole pile more tracking tools on you anyway. And
Right.
there's the ugly where we established in the Financial Oversight Board the Office of what's probably now called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. At the time, it was
Mm-hmm.
the Office for the Improvement of the Status of Minorities and Women. Um,
Right.
so you
So
get,
the way Turnip put it is, don't forget to bring up the effect of nationalization and state control on companies as leading to pause. So what does he mean by
yes,
that? He means effectively that the thing that we've all experienced, if we're in corporate America or maybe even in smaller companies, I don't know, is unconscious bias training and constant talking about how important diversity is and inclusion, and whatever you think of those things, they're sort of political, you could say, as opposed to, say, your company talking to you about how are we going to produce our product better, or you know right, they're talking
yeah,
about these things that are sort of um, larger societal or political concerns or something. And once again, going back to that theme that we were hitting on earlier in the show, talking about the truckers, this was not spontaneous. The reason that we're seeing this in like every company is because it's downstream from some legislation, namely the Dodd-Frank Act, right?
yeah. It's downstream from two things: legislation in the Dodd-Frank Act, but also uh, the effect of quantitative easing. So quantitative easing made the Fed as a bureaucratic institution a major provider of liquidity in the system, which gave it power as an owner of assets to dictate to many other institutions, right? So why is it
Right.
that
Right.
and there's 8,000 little threads for how this happened. We've covered a few of them, but
Hmm.
people should know that the fact we've covered a few of them, this is not an exhaustive review of the financial crisis. This is,
Hmm.
what can be accomplished in 5 hours of streaming or whatever this has been.
Right. Yeah, and so the consequences of what you just described is that we shouldn't expect that there'll be an end to, you know, wokeness in the corporation or whatever. Um, we should expect that with the federal government so deeply involved now, that whatever the next fad is, I mean, who knows what'll be next in 5 or 10 or 15 years, right? Whatever the next fad is, the big companies will be obediently following behind because they kind of have no choice. I mean,
Well,
is that
as long as this fundamental system stays in place, that is the case.
yeah, yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah, sorry. As long as the Fed can, as long as the new structure, the new post 2008 regime stays in place, corporate America is going to be on the same page, or else, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Excellent. Oh yeah. JG suggests I make a playlist. That might be a good idea, Black Horse. I'll just make a playlist. What would we call it? I guess the 2008 crisis, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's what I'll do. I'll make a playlist, 2008 Crisis, and then put a link to that playlist in each one of in the description for each one of these videos, so you can find your way to the rest if you start in the middle or start at the end. Because it's really good to hear the whole story that Black Horse laid out for us. All right. Well, good luck there in Canada, and good luck to the truckers who Black Horse unfortunately gave us a black pill that the truckers are they're being support. They were being supported briefly there, well, not briefly, for weeks in what they were doing. But Black Horse does not anticipate that there's going to be follow through and protection for them from personal consequences for going up against.
I would say that they need new
powers that
allies.
They need new allies. Yeah. And there aren't any forthcoming, at least from the 3 sets of elites that you described for us at the top of the show. So, yeah, if anyone jumped in late, definitely catch the first 20 minutes or whatever it was when we talked about the situation in Canada. Black Horse gave us some really good insight into the political structure there and how it's factoring into the trucker convoy stuff. Okay, all right. I think I'm caught up with everything. Let me check one more thing before I go. Make sure I didn't miss any tips. I'll just mention that I get really good support for the show through Subscribestar. You can find that link in the video description. Most supporters give a measly $5 a month to help this thing keep going and improve, and improvements that you will be able to visually notice coming very soon, and allow us to run the contest each year. I'm behind getting some prizes out because shipping internationally is a big pain in the butt, it turns out. Anyway, but we'll do another contest this year, hopefully bigger and better with everyone's support. And all right, thanks Black Horse again, and talk to you all later.